Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are having a wonderful weekend. I'm actually recording this on Super Bowl Sunday. Not much of a football fan myself, but hopefully, you guys are able to take a break this weekend and be with your friends and with your family. I wanted to check in and introduce our second week of our learning module on the characteristics of gifted and talented learners. Before I recap the discussion post, I just wanted to say that I was generally very impressed this week. I can tell that you really took feedback seriously from our previous post, and you guys did a lot of really in-depth analysis and good feedback on each other's discussion boards. So I was very happy to see that. And I did want to kind of discuss Adam's case because this is a very important one. And the reason I love this case study is because it's such a real world experience. When we think about gifted students, we often stereotypically consider the high achieving student. And several of you in your post delineated between the gifted and the high achieving. Usually, teachers think of gifted students as being in the front row of the classroom and raising their hand and always on time. And actually, those are more indicative of high achieving students. Now, not to say you can't be both gifted and high achieving, but it is important to know that there's a delineation between the two. So, with gifted learners, they truly require differentiation. They are not only academically different, but they literally experience the world differently. So their giftedness impacts their emotions, their social interactions, and their academic interactions. So no matter where they are, they're seeing the world through a different lens. If you think back to the documentary that we watched, I believe in our first week, about what it's like to be gifted, a lot of those students mention that they just see things differently. And it's not like they only see their science class and their math class differently. They see the playground differently. They see current events differently. It might be that they care about current events and their peers do not. So when we think about gifted versus high achieving, the most important thing to remember is that gifted students are always gifted. Not just when they're pulled out for their gifted services, not just when they're taking their AP class. They are also gifted on the playground. They are also gifted in the lunchroom. They are also gifted as they walk home or as they drive home. And I always tell that to myself when I'm working with these students because it's easy for me to only serve them during their quote gifted time, but they're always gifted. And that is most important because typically at one point of the day, they're going to be within a regular classroom setting, and we need to be treating these students differently in order to meet their unique needs. So Adam has misbehaved, and I believe it was Nicola, and correct me if I'm wrong in pronouncing that, who said that she put quotations around problem because this wasn't actually a problem. And I really love her post. I would encourage you to go back and read it. She demonstrated a very good, what we call dynamic perspective. In gifted education, we harp on the importance of taking a dynamic perspective rather than a deficit perspective. For a deficit perspective, we're looking for problems. What did the student do wrong? How can we close achievement gaps? How can we fix things? And with a dynamic perspective, we are looking for opportunities. So a dynamic perspective will interpret this behavior as having some underlying reason. We'll come back to those terms, deficit versus dynamic, when we complete our module on the invisible gifted, because it's really important when we are serving students from diverse populations in terms of gifted ed. So I wanted to call her out for that reason. Also, she, among others, mentioned one good way to approach this situation with Adam and his teacher and his parents rather, would be to use a gifted checklist and start to gather evidence that's clearly supported by research of his potential giftedness. That's important because we don't want to just trust ourselves to pick out who we think's gifted. If that happens, we're probably going to go with our stereotypical understanding of giftedness. So a good practice in educational assessment is being careful with validity. So validity is always asking, am I measuring what I think I'm actually measuring? So if I use a checklist, it's valid because I have a checklist that's based on research, and that checklist is corroborated with evidence of how students may demonstrate characteristics of giftedness. If I'm simply just nominating kids who I think are gifted, that's not very valid. What I'm doing is choosing favorites, and choosing favorites is not the same as nominating students who are gifted. Actually, if you talk to practice teachers, they will admit that sometimes gifted students are the most difficult to teach. So, a couple of other things. You all did a good job pointing out evidence of his giftedness through those interactions. Allison did a good job talking about perfectionism. So, perfectionism is very common in gifted students. Unlike the high achieving students, gifted students are more likely to not turn in an assignment. They will literally get the 0 rather than turning in something that's not perfect. A high achieving student is usually a little bit more extrinsically motivated. They want that 100 on time. The gifted student, they don't care as much about the grade, they care about the content. So if they get a 0, that's fine. They would rather get the 0 than show anything that was not perfect. So I thought that was good. A lot of you guys pointed out that Adam is clearly not working on the same level as his peers. So especially if we think back to his drawing of the turkey, it is, number one, neater. I believe it was Blair who did a good job pointing out that he was using different tools, so using these colored pencils and even shading them. That shows a lot of good fine motor skills. It's also drawn to scale, and it's very detailed. So we have a lot of different aspects of Adam's drawing of the turkey in comparison to other students at his same grade level. Remember, when we think about giftedness, it means that they are showing potential above average when compared to their peers. So he's clearly standing out. That would be my biggest argument for Adam to be gifted rather than a high achiever. He's not producing the same work. His work is clearly different. It is highly elaborative. There's lots of detail. That's what elaboration means. It is drawn to scale. It includes a lot of the different body parts of the turkey. So I definitely agree with the majority of you all who argue that he would potentially be identified as gifted. A few other things I wanted to point out. Bailey did a good job of saying he's clearly gifted, but could also be a high achiever, so I appreciate that. It is definitely possible to be both. Some gifted students are also high achievers, so they want to do everything on time and perfectly. That can produce a lot of social and emotional stress for students, whereas other gifted students, they're not necessarily high achievers, they're only motivated in what they care about. But I did like her point that he could be both, which I thought was very thoughtful. Riley did a good job pointing out his questioning attitude. So his question of, do you want this right or do you want it done, seems really dishonest or disrespectful, but really that's showing his questioning ability. And if we look at characteristics of giftedness, oftentimes they like to question the authority. Jenny had a great suggestion to meet one-on-one with Adam alone and not to bring in his parents until the teacher had the opportunity to meet with him. And I think that's often a step that we miss. Just in education in general, we start to dig deep and ask previous teachers and ask the principal and ask the parents when really the best thing to do might be to stop and talk to the child themselves. So I thought that was very intuitive. And see, other things we wanted to mention. Oh, Larissa, I thought it was a good point. She said, let's bring in a definition of giftedness. When I talked to the teacher and the parents, I thought that was very thoughtful in terms of preparing to have conversations. Delisha did a good job pointing out that this could turn into a problem of underachievement. So a lot of times when students are gifted, they are perfectionists and they want everything to be perfect, but then they can't do that in the time constraint of school. So they start to underachieve. That's very common. I myself have taught several students who, I had a student in the 99th percentile on all standardized tests, and she was in my regular grade level anatomy course, and I was astounded when I looked up her standardized test scores, and it really showed that she was underachieving in school. And once I got to know her, I realized she just didn't really appreciate the game of school. So that's very common. And piggybacking off of that, one of you, who do I give credit to? One of you mentioned bringing in some time management skills. I can't remember who it was. But I think that's an excellent idea. So let's kind of shift here from you have supported why we think Adam may be gifted. Let's shift to what do we do now? Because at the end of the day, he's going to have to finish the drawing of the turkey. We cannot give him extended time on everything, and that would also be a disservice to him. So in the real world, we have deadlines. Whether you're gifted or not, you have to meet deadlines in the real world. So it is important that we give him time management skills to help him be able to complete his work. In my opinion, the most important thing for Adam would be clearly to continue to give him this challenging environment, but also to start working on some discretionary skills so he can decide what are the aspects of my work that I need to be perfectionist about. For example, one really great way to serve students who are gifted is to give them a long-term project. And these long-term projects can last anywhere from a couple of weeks to the entire school year. And so what Adam could do is meet with his teacher. Teacher can get to know his interests, his strengths, and his areas for improvement, and design some sort of project that he can work on throughout a longer period of time. That would allow him to work on these skills and to continually dig deeply into something and leave open-ended opportunity. But if we just tell this teacher, well, he always needs extended time, that's not really practical. So one way that I've done this is in the classroom, I've had pizza boxes that I covered in like cute construction paper or whatever. And I told the students, anything in this box is yours, and I won't throw it away. I won't touch it. This is yours. And they were allowed to come back to the work in that box at any time throughout the semester. Leaving things open-ended like that is so important to develop creative thinking skills, and we'll talk about that openness to experience more when we discuss creativity. But it also gives students the opportunity to kind of dig deeper into the content. I think that would be a great adaptation for Adam, and also selecting some kind of ongoing project along with the teacher would help him as well. But I do think working on some time management would be effective in helping him combat some of these assumptions for perfectionism. You all did a great job on Adam. Again, I'll have your discussion post graded soon, but I wanted to say that I was impressed by the amount of detail that you used in your analysis. So in terms of this week, you are going to complete your own case study, and I want you to think of one student that you have either taught or that you know personally. Think of that one kid who you've always thought, I think he may be gifted. I think she just seems different. There's something about her. It does not have to be a student that you've necessarily had in your classroom. It could be a student you have interacted with. It could be a peer, perhaps. It could be a brother, a sister, a niece, a nephew, a son or daughter. Anyone that you have a lot of anecdotal evidence for, anyone that you feel confident you could write a narrative about. So what we're doing is completing a gifted child case study. If you look in your Blackboard, you can see a whole content folder on this. So I have uploaded a gifted child checklist. Your first step would be to complete that checklist for the student that you want to analyze in detail. It's a simple checklist. I want you to use it with a grain of salt. I do not like this checklist. Later in the semester, we will use a different checklist that I am a much bigger fan of, but I like to show you both, and I just wanted to plant that idea in your head. So what you'll do is with this checklist, you will simply check off which of these characteristics you have observed in your student. Then you are writing a 1 to 2 page narrative that tells me why or why not you believe this student is gifted. Okay, so on Blackboard, you'll see a couple of specific things that I'm looking for. The first is that chart, so completing that checklist or chart. And the second is discussing how you have seen these characteristics manifest in the student. So if you're checking off curiosity, then within your narrative, I need to see how have you seen curiosity. So don't just say, John is curious. You need to say, oftentimes I have to turn the lights off 3 or 4 times during free reading time to get John's attention because he's so interested in reading books about the Revolutionary War, because he's really digging deep and he's curious about this one topic. Or oftentimes I tell John he can only have 3 questions per day because he asks me too many questions. Okay, so don't just list the characteristics that you've checked off. Give me some anecdotal, very specific examples of how you've seen those characteristics. And lastly, make sure that you use sources to back up your claim. So if you look at the rubric, in order to receive full points for that, I'm looking for at least 3 sources. You can cite them just as you would within your discussion post. So I only need the internal citation. You are not required to include an external reference. So again, I'm looking for the checklist and clearly tying that checklist with specific examples in your narrative, and then sources to back up whether or not you believe your student is gifted. In the past, I've had students write clear evidence of the gifts, of the characteristics on the checklist. That would be great, but you're not required to do that as long as you're providing specifics within your narrative. That's fine. I uploaded 2 copies of the checklist. One is a Word document in case you want to type right on it, and the other is a PDF. I've had students in the past just print off the PDF and actually write by hand, which is fine as well. Just scan it in for me. Okay, so as always, I'll be looking for your assignments to be posted Sunday evening. I'm always here if you have any questions or concerns, and otherwise, I hope you have a wonderful week.